distinguished guests, graduates of the University of Queensland, colleagues, friends of the university, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest in the University of Queensland Global Leadership Series, which this evening is titled, Are Our Cities Making Us Sick? This event is brought to you, and I was very tempted when reading these notes earlier to say by the number 7 and the letter C, but instead this event is brought to you by the School of Chemistry and Molecular Bioscience and the School of Geography, Planning and Environmental Management in the Faculty of Science, of which I'm the Executive Dean. As part of this welcome, I very much wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Queensland is situated, the Turrbal and Yagara people. Now tonight, of course, that acknowledgement has particular relevance. Those people once lived on this land in a largely natural environment. By contrast, today this university forms part of the city of Brisbane, which together with the broader southeast Queensland region is home to some 4 million people. This type of change, which has occurred in this region in the last couple of centuries, is occurring right across the globe ever more rapidly. Essentially, humanity is in the process of changing its address from the wide open spaces to the cities. Half of the world's population now live in cities, and so it sort of makes sense that the way that we create urban environments is liable to have an impact on our health. Tonight, we have assembled expert panellists in the fields of public health policy, demography, and human geography. All have strong connections with this university, and I also welcome them and thank them for their time this evening. Tonight's moderator is Peter O'Donoghue, who is a Professor of Parasitology at the University of Queensland. Peter has been a joint winner of the Prime Minister's Award for University Teacher of the Year. In 2002 was awarded the Doctor of Science by the University of Queensland, in 2005, and was elected as a Fellow of the Australian Society for Parasitology in 2006. I'll now hand over to Peter O'Donoghue to introduce the panellists. I hope you all enjoy this evening very much.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful little evening where we're going to explore, in this Global Leadership Series, the topic of Are Our Cities Making Us Sick? The simple answer for me is yes. What about a show of hands? Let's take a straw poll from the audience now. Who believes that our cities are making us sick? You have to vote yes or no, there's no maybes. So, all right, we have about 80%, all right? Of course, we're talking about contemporary at the moment, so our cities at present. If you look back through history, you will actually find that sickness and cities went together quite well, hand in hand for quite some time. So we're going to be examining this topic. Mankind, humankind, is faced with some big challenges. We've got population growth growing through the roof. It's a very difficult topic to talk about. We have got resource management. It depends on your perspective, whether you're a miner or a landowner or an agriculturalist or a consumer or a city dweller, etc. We've got climate change, something that's being engaged at parliamentary level with the general public. It's something that's hot within topics, and people are exploring lots to do with climate change. It's quite controversial. It's not as cut and dried as people would like to think it to be. And finally, we've got this topic of urbanisation, people living in cities. And I'm glad to see that while the other three get lip service and things are going and there are people talking about them, when it comes to urbanisation, we've finally got a little forum where we can actually start talking about it, planning for it, because a significant portion of the population do live in these cities. So we've got 4 people to talk about Are Cities Making Us Sick? My name is Peter O'Donoghue. I'm a Professor of Parasitology in the former Department of Microbiology and now Molecular Biosciences. I work on infectious diseases. I work on infectious diseases of humans and animals. And over the course of my 40-year career, I've come to reaffirm that animals have herd diseases and humans have crowd diseases. And it's very easy to see why. When animals or humans live in close contact, disease transmission is much easier to achieve for the pathogen because we share a whole lot of things. So when we come to this topic I firmly believe, yes, cities are making us sick. What do you think, Dominic?
Thanks, Peter. I suppose I'm going to have to sit on the fence a little bit with this one and say, potentially, possibly, maybe. I suppose my talk, when I get to it today, will be taking you through some of the spatial aspects of how we can go about examining health within the city environment. And so, to me, it's not quite as clear-cut as sort of Richard's sort of parasitology side of things. It's more to do with the person aspect. So I'm going to sit on the fence to a certain extent for the time being until pushed on this. I suppose if you've seen my bio, my background might seem a little bit strange for this, having come from a corporate real estate environment. I would actually have to hasten to add that that's only something new. My background in academia is actually health inequalities, so I have a long-standing research interest in this. I am on, apparently. So that's very much the kind of attitude I'll be bringing to it, would be the health inequality side of things, but with a bit of a, shall we say, corporate real estate tinge to it.
Okay. Robert, what's your view?
Well, I think it depends which city you live in, how wealthy you are, and what your aspirations are. Some people live very well in cities, and some people don't, particularly in the developing world. So I am my name is Robert Bush, and I'm the hold the Ipswich Foundation Research Chair in Healthy Communities, and my life's work has been on the impact of the social, economic and physical environments on the health status of populations, often in urban environments. And I actually started as a political economist and was interested in the governance of cities and how that impacted on the well-being of people. But I became restless and decided to become a psychologist, which, if you are a psychologist, you know, has got nothing to do with people. It's all got to do with statistics. And if you ever do an undergraduate degree in psychology, you'll learn a lot about statistics. And worked in that field for a time. I was very interested in how human behaviour in cities moved, and then became restless again and went off and did medical epidemiology. So in a sense, I then went back to populations and how population status, and particularly health inequalities, operates and how it functions throughout the world. So my answer is that it depends who you are, how wealthy you are, and which city you live in around the world.
Rosemary, what's your view?
Well, thank you. I'm going to do the typical academic trick and say, well, it's possibly the wrong question. It's not, are our cities making us sick, but are we making our cities sick? And I'm coming to that perspective. I'm a human geographer. I am a graduate of the University of Queensland many years ago, but I now work as a senior research scientist and the officer in charge of the Cairns CSIRO lab in the Australian Tropical Forest Institute, where we have a fantastic facility with a huge tropical herbarium and a lot of other wonderful science going on. My science leads me to work with communities at multiple scales to find better ways of managing the natural and cultural resources in cities and in rural areas. I take a leadership role in that through the World Commission on Protected Areas and a Commission on Environment, Economic and Social Policy. And we try to strengthen and understand people who are taking leadership themselves to move towards sustainability all over this globe. Because I came in, I looked at that leadership and think, I don't really want to take responsibility for where we're leading the globe at the moment, but there are different options that are being considered.
Well, we have 4 people with 4 different views, and with this topic, 80% of the audience already, by show of hands, has indicated that they think the affirmative is true. We need to back engineer and have a look at the title. So when it comes to some of the nouns, city, what is a city? It sounds a simple enough question. Intuitively, we know what it is. We think it's defined. I went to that bastion of information, the Wikipedia. And here I have 29 pages downloaded which doesn't answer the question. It basically has differentials, and it tells me that each country is different, each shire, each council, and it can't come up with a consensus. It then starts talking about the reasons for city development, and again, there are no real definitive reasons back through history about why people have got together in cities. So I'm going to leave what is a city and why people live in them to Dominic. I want to home in on this idea of what is sick then. Are we going to talk about an individual person and their state of well-being? Or are we going to talk about their extended family? Are we going to talk about the whole community or the whole population? So we need to define it in human health. I think it's all of those. We have to consider individual sicknesses. We have to consider population health. All right? But it goes beyond that. Within those cities live a vast amount of animals, and a lot of these animals, from my perspective, carry infectious diseases that humans can get and vice versa. So we need to consider animal health. There's also the good advantages of pets. Pets are very good for you, so your mental well-being is enhanced if you have a pet. So we're looking at physical and behavioural animal health. We have companion domestic animals, we have feral animals and wildlife. And it goes a step further. We need to consider the environment of the city, the air we breathe, the water we drink and utilise, the soil on which it's built and all the plants that are there. So I would like to take a holistic approach and say if we're going to look at cities, we need to define them a little bit. If we're going to look at sickness, it has to be a holistic approach. It can't be just one specific little individual thing. We need to take a whole environmental and human and animal approach to this question. So let's have a look at what a city is. Dominic, this is your province.
Okay, I have 5 minutes. I have 5 minutes to go around the world via England and back to Durack. So what I would say is strap yourself in, sit back. We could be going quite quickly today. Hopefully I've been given a bit of indulgence though, because as first speaker I was the first person I was asked if I could actually quickly define what a city was. As we've just heard, there's 29 pages, so quickly defining might be a little bit difficult. So I took my trusted source, the Oxford English Dictionary. As you can tell, I'm English. They're not much help, I have to say. A town created a city by charter and usually containing a cathedral. Fantastic. I feel as though I know so much more about cities now. Brilliant, excellent. Well, we know what a city is. We can move on from that. In all reality, though, cities, though, we know that it's a critical mass of people at a density of some description. I don't think for the purposes of this discussion, I don't think it really matters what makes a small town or a large town into a city or a large city into a metropolitan area or a conurbation or whatever. I don't think that actually necessarily is an important differentiation at this particular point in time. I think the important thing is that we understand that it is a bringing together of humanity in a comparatively small area. Why is it important is the next thing. Well, currently, estimates according to the UN, about 50% of the world's population living in an urban area. If we then bring that forwards to 2050, we go up to 67%. So 2 out of every 3 people globally will be living in an urban area, or whether it's a town or a large town or a city or whatever we want to call it. If we take that down to the Australian level, 89% right now, moving up to about 92, 93%. So we're dealing with an increasing amount of people that's only going to get larger as time goes on. So it very much is a real world problem which we're facing now, which is only going to be getting worse. And I think this is why it's critical that we think about these kinds of things now. Equally, if you think about the nature of where population growth is, a lot of the growth is going to be through Asia, sub-Saharan Africa. Arguably, in these developing countries, they might be, at this moment, less well equipped to deal with that level of growth and some of the issues and the health issues which ensues. Obviously, with an increase in the number of population in a city, we're going to have not only more cities, but we're going to have larger cities as well. Currently, there's about 23 cities of 10 million plus. By 2025, 37 cities of 10 million plus. So we're going to have more cities and they're going to be larger. Hopefully that's now giving you the grounding in what we're going to be talking about today, admittedly relatively quick. So let's come on, so we've done the globe now, let's quickly hop across to the northern hemisphere and let's take North Yorkshire. Let's look at the question, are cities making us sick? Now this is some work I did quite a while ago now. Blue areas have relatively good health, Red areas have relatively poor health. The redder the area, the worse the health. The bluer the area, the better the health. This is for Yorkshire and the Humber in northern England. Unsurprisingly, North Yorkshire is generally rural. South Yorkshire, very urban, very built up. Anyone watch The Full Monty? Filmed in South Yorkshire. You kind of get the impression of what it's like. So if you look at that as a health outcome, you'd say, well, yes, cities must be making us ill. Look at this. However, that's a very simplistic approach to take. For example, did you know that South Yorkshire was heavily involved in the mining industry, coal mining? So are the poor health outcomes just a legacy from that industry? Equally, with that rural-urban health divide, and we're going back to urbanisation now, demographic transition and all of those kinds of things, there is that rural good health, urban bad health. However, is it actually related to affluence? We know that affluence is positively correlated to good health. Urban areas generally tend to be more affluent. Rural areas generally tend to be more affluent than the urban areas. So what looks as though it was quite a simple answer to begin with suddenly becomes a little bit more complicated than that. Now let's dance back to the Southern Hemisphere now and back into Queensland. I did say this was going to be a truly global presentation, and we are heading around the world at a fair rate of knots. Again, let's look at our most rural areas, our most sort of remote areas. Currently, according to standardised mortality rates, so we're looking at total death, and that's accounting for age and sex, the most remote areas have the worst health outcomes. So again, it seems like, well, maybe rural is better than urban, but deeply rural is not as good though. So there is somewhere along the continuum that you can go. I should add that I'm probably going to be posing far more questions in this presentation than I'm going to be answering. Let's bring it back to Brisbane. Let's bring it back to an urban environment. This is Brisbane in 1991. Again, blue, good health, red, poor health. The thing I want to focus on here is this inner city location, inner city suburbs. Let's move it forward now to 2006. Think urban renewal, urban gentrification, regentrification, the redevelopment of those inner city suburbs. What do we see? Suddenly, there is an improvement in the health outcomes in those areas. They've gone from the deep red to the whites and in some cases the blues. Now clearly that's not because the areas have become healthier, it's because of the people that live in those areas. So one of the fundamental things that we really have to take into account in this is that migration is operating to enforce and to exacerbate, or in some instances to quell these kinds of processes. Okay? There is selective migration. So in the answer to the question, are cities making us sick? I think we have to take account of the fact it's not only the environment in which we live in, it's how we live in that environment. And very, very quickly, because I'm sure I'm beginning to run out of time, because I've timed myself doing this and I was always over time, let's look at that last aspect. It's how we live in the city. Now, a particular bugbear of mine, I have to say, is labour force containment rates. This comes back to urban sprawl, time costs of commuting, and the stresses and everything that it brings with it. So we can relate commuting to a stressful activity. I dare say that in every economic development study that I've done for a range of organisations, always tacked on at the end, improving labour force containment. That means workers are living and working in the same local area. It doesn't matter whether we look at it from an origin point of view or a destination point of view, fundamentally it doesn't quite work like that. Okay? We still have the dormitory suburb. So if we're thinking about a sprawling urban area and then the costs not only of the commute, but how we go about commuting, whether it's public transport, private transport, cars, active transport, walking, cycling, those kinds of things, we fundamentally need to take into account these kinds of patterns of population movement. The very last thing that I want to introduce, I did warn you I was going to be posing more questions than answering, is this concept of food deserts. And I quite like this. This is a little bit of a thing of mine. It comes heavily out of the English literature and the English planning system. The removal of supermarkets and major food shops out of city centres to out of town locations. Therefore, they can only be accessed by those people with cars, generally more affluent or younger. Older people don't tend to drive so much. So the absence of a fresh food supply in an area is then known as a food desert. So to what extent is that actually happening over here? So we can actually look at this. Believe it or not, these are all the major supermarkets within the Greater Brisbane area. Through various spatial interaction modelling, we can then run a spatial interaction model. We can come out with some outputs, which give us the outputs here. And we can look at those who have high food service provision, low food service provision, high affluence, low affluence. And fundamentally, it's this group in the bottom corner that are the important ones: low affluence, low food service provision, so low access to supermarkets. We can then run the outputs of the supermodel, of the spatial interaction model, and as I said, I'll get us to Durack by the end of the presentation, and here we are. Durack, Acacia Ridge, Inala, and also Willawong are the areas that have been identified. I wouldn't necessarily say that they were a food desert. So it's not that they don't have access to fresh food, and obviously the health benefits that then come with that. What I would say is they do have 3 supermarkets in their local area. However, they're half-line supermarkets. They're below 2,000 square metres. For a population of roughly 25,000 people, that can support about, given the averages, 3 full-line supermarkets. So whilst there is a low service provision, I wouldn't necessarily call it a food desert. Now, my friend here is standing up, so it means I have to stop. But what I would do, just to conclude, is that we need to take into account it's not only the environment in which we live, it is also how we live in that environment as to whether cities are making us sick.
When I was doing a bit of research for this presentation, I come across this wonderful quote out of Diseases and Plagues in History and Modern Times, Part 2, means there was a Part 1 to this. Quote, "From their beginnings until the 20th century, cities have been pest holes. In fact, only when towns became big cities did massive die-offs become a regular part of human life." Well, I don't know about you, but are you used to massive die-offs as part of your human life? When it comes to recent human development, we recognise 5 main eras. We have a derivation phase, the phase of civilisation development, exploration, colonisation, and now we're in a period of globalisation. And each of these has impact on the infectious disease natures that have been out there. Let's have a quick look at each of those. Derivation. There's no disputing now the African origins of hominoids, Homo sapiens, coming out of Africa. Basically, we were hunter-gatherer societies living on the savannah, came down out of the forest onto the grasslands, lived in close association with animals, and were susceptible to zoonoses, diseases from animals which got into the human populations. So we lived with these old world diseases, particularly those that are transmitted by vectors, mosquitoes and ticks and sandflies and nasty biting things. So this was the world of the old world diseases. I won't go through any lists here, I've just put up a few to populate them so that you can see, yes, this was the era of zoonoses. People are now doing molecular biological studies and showing, yes, indeed, a lot of these diseases do have animal analogues and genetic similarities and these sorts of things. So even while some of the species are specific for humans, they do have analogues in animals, and this is supposed to be proof of their zoonotic, their animal origins. But then something amazing happened. Humans got up and started walking out of Africa. We have approximate 5 different episodes of people moving, the out of Africa migrations. So these happened beginning around 7,000 years ago. So we turned from being hunters to herders to farmers to villagers and to living in cities. As we got up and moved, this was the development of agriculture. We started producing food in abundance. We didn't have to go chasing it. We then set up these villages and we had industry and commerce and trade and protection and all those things. This was the development of civilization occurring. But then something happened. We had the development of the Sahara Desert coming across, so we had a separation of the old world and the new world. So for the next 5,000 years or so, we had diseases, the old world ones, stuck in Africa, but the development of the new world diseases. And these were the development of the zymotics, the crowd diseases. Here we have smallpox, syphilis, bubonic plague, leprosy, measles, rubella. There's a huge list of these crowd diseases that have gone into urban dwellings and killed thousands, millions of people. Black plague, the Black Death, the significance that's had on human development of this planet has been profound. So these were the communicable crowd diseases. Then we got into this exploration phase. 400 years ago, the Europeans moving out of Europe and discovering the world. The rest of the world was still inhabited, remember? There's old world out there. So basically we had this intermingling. We had the discoverers bringing their crowd diseases to new locations and also experiencing the old world diseases. So literally, when the new world met the old world, this was mutually disastrous for both. And we can trace back to all sorts of problems occurring, the demise of the Aztec Indians, and all sorts of problems running to the discovered people succumbing to diseases. Measles, a simple thing like measles has decimated huge numbers of populations. But equally, the discoverers, when they went to these locations, the white human race going to Africa, succumbing to sleeping sickness and to malaria. So we had this mutually disastrous exchange of old world and new world diseases. This first encounter, it was bad for both parties. Then we had this period of colonisation. Moving into the old world, it was a rich place, this new world. It had agricultural productivity, it had wonderful things, it had plants, it had potatoes and tobacco and all sorts of things. So this colonisation phase, this establishment phase, we had a translocation between the new and the old world. Much to our disgust, the development of the slave trade was brought in. So in this particular case, they took a labour force who was resistant to old world diseases off to new locations and exploited them for their labour. So in this particular case, colonisation phase, it led to a more blending or more intermixing of the new and old world. So the spread of these diseases, of course, the Africans, the slaves that were taken off, that had this herd immunity to tropical diseases, were taken off into new locations to grow sugar cane and to do all sorts of other things because they were more supposedly resistant to the endemic diseases in the country as well as the heat and the unbearable conditions that the tropics had. But they were decimated by a lot of the crowd diseases that they had no resistance to. And equally, we then found that there was slower cultural assimilation. There was a blending of the genome of both. And it's been slow and it's still ongoing, but in this particular period, we're having a mixing pot. We've got a reconstitution of the susceptibility and resistance between the new world and the old world. All right? So the second encounter of the old world and the new world, we're slowly reconstituting the gene pool. Now, this is the era we live in. This is the era of globalisation. In the last 100 years, because of world wars and translocations and the development of cheap transport and planes and everything, we're able to get people from all corners of the world to anywhere in the world. And in this particular case, with technological revolutions and economic globalisation, we have got the emergence of lots of diseases, crowd diseases, zoonoses that are into everything, but the population density has become so large that we're now pushing into new areas. And as we push into new areas, we're meeting things. We've met retrovirus, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus picked up from primates in Africa, West Nile virus, SARS, and the list goes on. So as we move into new territories by virtue of our population explosion, we are now rediscovering the zoonoses. So my basic take-home message is, whilst our origins are back there in the old world, where we were exposed to tropical diseases from animal sources, we moved to the new world, we built cities, we developed zymotics, these crowd diseases which were highly communicable. We're now in the modern world, we've done the whole circle. History repeats, we're back looking at emerging diseases. So we're looking at new zoonoses that are coming out. So animals have herd diseases, humans have crowd diseases. It's by virtue of our development, our geographic location, our urbanisation, how we derive livings, And from an infectious disease perspective, it's easy to see how an organism can get from one host to another. If we live close to each other, it's much easier for these communicable diseases to be communicated. Okay? So I was basically talking about cities being places for catching diseases. Robert, do you have a different spin on all of this?
Oh, yes, I do. So I might just start by giving just a very brief two-line explanation of sickness. Of course, we do become sick through infectious disease, but we now in certainly many cities, and certainly modern cities, have public health units, and we have good public health surveillance to deal with that, and we have immunisation as well. So while it's a threat, we have in the public health field in cities addressed much of that, although there are still threats to the future. The second form of sickness in cities is a result of the way we have poorly designed and built cities in the past, of which asbestosis and lead poisoning leading to brain damage, particularly in children, are examples. And we know a lot about that now and what to do about it, and certainly in modern cities, a lot of that is regulated. But the third area is chronic disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, diseases of lifestyle. And in many cities, including development cities around the world, the big threat is thought to be that the way we live in cities over the first 20, 30, 40, 50 years of our life will suddenly catch up with us, and we'll now spend the last 30 years or more of our life with some form of chronic disease which needs to be managed. So, depending on what kind of city you live in and its development, there are different kinds of disease patterns. And this is a map of the world where cities of the future are likely to develop, and particularly where slums are. And from a world perspective, the major issue or threat to health in cities is slum dwellings. And the red areas on this map are where the cities, major cities of the world have major slum areas. Now, the reason why we have slums is because people have aspirations and see the city as a place of meeting their aspiration. And even if you live in a slum, for most people, those aspirations and education, work, something better for the children actually does occur. But most of the development in the next 30 years is thought to be in those red areas, not in cities like ours, where they may grow somewhat, but in the developing countries. And the real challenge is how to address all those three issues: infection, diseases related to the way we build the city, and also chronic disease. I mention that because we live in a very privileged part of the world, and for us, we can tinker with the design of the city a bit, but it's a very serious issue for the developing part of the world, and that is where much of the effort will be in terms of health in the city in the next 4 decades. We really have two kinds of approaches from a public health in the city point of view. We can take the approach that developed in the century before last, and this is John Snow, who solved the problem of cholera in Soho in London by daring to suggest it wasn't in the air but was in the water, and finding that it was in the water and that we needed clean water, better sewage systems and clean air and so on, these very basic elements of the city. We can take the disease prevention approach, and we're quite good at that now, or we can look at the city in a different way. We can look at the city as a place of human aspiration, like the people in the slums. Most of us live in cities because we believe it will be good for us in terms of what we want to be and who we want to become and how we want to develop the city. This is a picture of Shanghai. But in all of these cities, despite that, there is a level of inequality. There are areas of the city which have usually quite prosperous and good health, and there are areas of the city that are not, and that's the case in a place like Brisbane. Depending where you live in Brisbane, your chance of getting a chronic disease is very much higher than living in other areas, and that's because of the people we are, but some of it is also because of the environment that we live in, and I'll explain how that goes along. So there are two kinds of approaches, and I sit very much in the human aspiration approach. And I started this work in the 1970s in Birmingham in the UK, in Nechel's housing estate in the centre of Birmingham. These are two parts of it. And half the housing estate was knocked down, and these tower blocks were built. And in the old area, that stayed for a while. Now, in the old area, there was a lot of problem with damp. And so people had respiratory problems, older people didn't thrive, had difficulty getting over infections, there was a lot of skin complaints. And when we put people in these, we were very authoritarian, when we put people in these tower blocks, all of that disappeared. But we've managed to create in this part of the city a dislocation. There was a vast increase in injuries related to violence. There was a vast increase in children's inability to thrive, particularly developmentally. And there was a vast increase in depression, particularly amongst the elderly. So by creating only the physical environment and shifting it, we had created a set of other problems. Now, sometimes by having a different aspiration, things can go wrong too. And my work in Southeast Asia around traffic, increases in traffic and the city, which we thought was a traffic problem, it wasn't until we realised that the people on the motorcycle there are on a motorcycle because they have aspirations. The motorcycle is a way from moving from the walking to being the bicycle to the motorcycle to the car, that's the progress through development in the city that people move on. And it's not the case that if you live in Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam, where most people are on motorcycles, that the death rate is higher. And it's not the case that the death rate is higher in very sophisticated cities in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, where in fact the number of cars on the road have been reducing. It is when you get somewhere halfway up the development ladder in Malaysia and in parts of Indonesia. And why is that? Because aspiration in the city, moving up, gets to a point where there's a hard and soft body problem. Half the people on the road got no protection, and half the people in the car. And that's when it goes through the roof. So the challenge about developing cities in the world and road traffic is that as aspirations go up, so injuries increase as a result of economic aspiration. I just want to give a brief example to finish off around the notion of the city and obesity, and the notion of the ground rules for actually designing cities, we think, for the future that might address the problem of obesity. The first is that cities that work well in all sorts of problems have sound governance. They put the health agenda into all the other public policy agendas. That is, in the transport agenda, addresses health. Education addresses health. Urban design addresses health, not in the hospitals and clinics. The second is that you need to involve citizens in the development. In Indonesia and Malaysia, you need to involve people and find ways so that people can wear helmets. You need to use multi-level strategies. There's no point in just developing the building structure if you don't involve the social structure. You need to be interdisciplinary. There was a time when Snow was around when public health advocates and town planners were one. We lost that in the 1930s when we began to believe, and we introduced immunisation, that we could protect people against all of this. Now we've moved back to realising that public health and town planners need to work together in order to create better environments. And we need to focus on inequalities, because in some areas people have very good health in the city, in others they don't. And yet the cost of that for the city is borne by everyone. And we need to understand people's aspirations. So the way in which we try to redesign the city for health in public health now, we may start with green space. And we do know that the green space is related to health, at least from cross-sectional studies and in very large studies. Very good study in the Lancet a couple of years ago that looked across Britain and showed that if you lived in a green space in a city, you lived longer. But one of the problems is that as you start doing those studies into narrower and narrower areas, it all falls apart. Partly because people who like green space tend to be a bit more educated, tend to go running and eat good food, so they just move there. So it may be about people and not about green space. It's probably both. If we look at the urban built environment and health, it's interesting in that the modern city we have now built is different to the notion of the church and the steeple and or the mosque and so on in the town square. We now zone everything. We live in one area, we go to work in another area, we go to recreation in another area, and so forth. And we build large corridors between these areas to shift goods and people. There's been very little work done on what the impact of that kind of zoning does on relation to health. For example, the amount of time people now sit on a train or a car every day, and the relationship between that and sedentary lifestyle and cardiovascular disease. And transport, where once cities were built for all sorts of arrangements in terms of sitting and moving. This is from Gaia, bicycles in Gaia, where most people in this part of India simply go to work on a bicycle. And the green space is also from Gaia, with children playing in a parkland area. And if we go to other aspects of the city, we can look at the work and the school environment, the extent to which the environment around schools is conducive to walking to school, or in fact is dangerous to walk to school, and the way in which the work routine of the day. How much of work these days is in fact sitting still for about 7 or 8 hours a day. Even labourers, of course, sit still. The only people who don't these days are nurses, airline attendants, and a couple of others. Most of us just sit still all day. And the notion of the food supply. Now, one of the issues interesting that's just beginning to happen in research in this area is the dynamics of the difference in food supply between different areas of a city and its economic aspirations of different people. If you live in an area of a city where people want good food and they go and buy it, the chances are that the food supply in supermarkets and in delis and so on will move in that direction. If you live in an area where the aspirations are not like that, then the food supply will stay different. And you begin to get an inequality in the nature of the quality of food that's eaten, and you get an inequality divide. A lot of work that needs to be done in that area about understanding how different areas develop, in this case in the economic environment and therefore the physical environment of retail. This is a piece of self-promotion. This is the Ipswich study, which is the first study in the world to follow over the long term urban environments and people together to see what happens being conducted in Ipswich. And I mention that as one way of trying to solve this. So my take-home message is, in the city, govern well, have good sound infectious disease surveillance, address health inequalities, because if you don't, you will get some people ill, some people well, and we'll all pay for it. Invest in the evidence. I'm from a university. Involve people and their aspirations, not only disease control. Thank you.
We're on a roll. I'll leave questions until the last speaker, so Rosemary.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pick up on Robert's point about cities are places of human aspiration to make a comment that is a bit off my topic to start with. I'm an Australian trained scientist, and so I have looked at people's movement out of Africa, and the genetic evidence is that people came here first. And probably between about 40,000 and 60,000 years ago, and we know that in order to do that, they had to cross water. So we still have Australian Aboriginal people living here who are continuous since then, which is a wonderful culture and a wonderful asset, I think, to our nation. And as you know, many of them face great challenges in their lives. So I just had to challenge that little bit of European orthodoxy where we had people going out of Africa everywhere except Australia. They did come here. So I've said maybe we've asked the wrong question, and I just want to talk a little bit. We've got this big flight of people coming to the cities, and we're hearing how cities are making us sick, so are we all silly? Or is Brisbane actually a wonderful place to live? And I've put a couple of images there of Brisbane, this beautiful river that everyone loves to run along, this beautiful park. And I'm going to talk about maybe there is something going on here about the connection between people and nature in cities that we haven't really quite nailed yet. We have new research that is showing that there is a difference between natural environments and synthetic environments when it comes to exercise. People who get better mental health benefits from exercising in natural versus synthetic environments. And guess what? If there's water involved, they get even better mental health benefits. Mood and self-esteem goes up. It has a greater effect on people who are mentally ill. This is a wonderful thing. Best thing of all, that the larger benefits come from short engagement. John Howard in his 10-minute walk early in the morning had something really well going on. There are issues around that though. The problems with trying to provide nature in cities like Brisbane actually I think has done not too bad a job of. There's often inequitable access. Green infrastructure is less available to lower socioeconomic groups. And I'll put up this slide of a book that was written in 2005 about nature deficit disorder, which is someone writing about a lot of the developmental disorders of children like ADD may in fact be related to that they're not getting the natural environments, that climbing trees is actually different to climbing monkey bars. And it's quite a syndrome that's associated with obesity, as we've just heard about from the last speaker. People might look at Brisbane as an urban sprawl, but it might also be green infrastructure, equitably distributed. Of course, I wouldn't argue that you don't need more compact designs like the one, I don't know if I can point with this, but this sort of compact designs, yes, there's a lot of efficiency goes with it. You can still do that with some green infrastructure though. I think we all recognise you have to avoid clearing natural areas. I'm going to say you must have efficient public transport because my next point, and this is the one about, is it the cities that are making us sick or us making the city sick? Because I don't think you can have a healthy city without having a healthy planet. And I want to talk a little bit here about some of the evidence of climate change. We know Brisbane is getting hotter and drier, and these are two maps that are being produced by the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO, for whom I work. This one shows the trend in annual rainfall from 1960 to 2009. And guess what? Brisbane's getting drier. Most of the eastern seaboard is getting dry. This is the Great Sandy Desert where I've had the privilege to work with some of the traditional owners. It's getting wetter. It's looking quite amazing quite often now, the Great Sandy Desert. But Brisbane is also getting hotter, quite a lot hotter. 2004, we know we had a major heat wave, 12 people died. We know that there are greater impacts on the elderly from heat. We know we're going to have more heat waves. So we're going to need heat wave plans. We're going to need to plan for emergency responses to extreme events. But what's the first thing that people want to do when it's hot? Tell me. Audience interaction. What do you do when you're feeling hot? Someone goes for a swim, a lot of people turn on the air conditioning. And what we all know, that's forcing more greenhouse gas. So we can start getting ourselves into a very scary feedback cycle. It isn't only going to affect us, though, in terms of things like heat waves. Vector-borne diseases are moving south. And this is a map I got out of a study in 2006 that was looking at the probability, and this is the highest climate projections on the IPCC projection. So this is a high rate of climate change. And look here, you have malaria. The green areas are where they're presently unsuitable for malaria mosquitoes, but likely to become suitable. And the red areas where it's presently suitable, but become unsuitable. And if you look at dear old Brisbane again, we could be suitable for malaria. So I'm saying to you, your city can't be healthy unless you also have a healthy planet. Thank you.
I'm sure something in the four talks must have been provocative. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the open forum section. Any questions?
Hi, I was just wondering, would the best method of transport be a combination between public transport and active transport? Because private transport is probably not the best method, so what do you think?
I guess that was aimed at me. Going up, White. Still on my microphone now. It's all right, I can get it. that's trying to compartmentalise areas, and it's sort of fundamentally missing what we've heard a few speakers talk about today, is that there are regions, and that regions function independently of one another. They have their own roles, and that people don't necessarily want to live and work in the same area and play in the same area. So we need to try to find out ways to get that movement of people as quickly and as sort of efficiently as possible. And we've heard that private transport isn't necessarily the way to go. Some professions have to use private transport. It's just the nature of their job. Equally, some locations it's not viable to have public transport going to them. But fundamentally, yes, I think you're right. It's that if we can come up with a situation where you can combine public transport with active transport, such as walking, cycling, running, or whatever, then that is very much the way to go. And corporate real estate hat on now, that's very much the way that we're seeing things go in the city. Buildings are becoming more attractive to workers that have shower facilities, that have bike racking facilities. So it's very much it's very much an easy win for the employer to provide adequate services for the employees. And that morning run or the evening run home from work, if you're particularly keen, the run in and the run home from work, is actually a very good source of stress relief and keeping fit and healthy at the same time. So what you're saying is fundamentally correct, and what we're seeing permeate through the real estate markets is also sort of underpinning that as well.
It's interesting to speculate because there have been some good urban social development plans and experiments where they've tried to reduce the distance between residence and place of work by the development of a science city or a technological city or a university city. So they're going to try and get people, and yet a lot of those weren't really successful because the people who live close to work sort of felt as though their freedom or free will had been taken away, and a lot of these social experiments had negative impact as opposed to health promotion. What do you think, Robert?
Yeah, I agree. There's, you can think of this business in a couple of different ways. I mean, if you start looking at, children and reasonably fit young people and older people and so on, and you look at the sort of journeys you have to take each week. I mean, some journeys are fine on public transport or on a bike or walking, and other journeys are not. I mean, it's pretty difficult to, go on a bike and get the weekly shopping for a family of 5. So, in a sense, one way of looking at this is to look at the notion of what the journey is that people have to take, and to mix and match very, very much. One of the things that's quite interesting about the notion of the city and lifestyle is this kind of notion in which we segment things off, and that is that in order to stay fit or to kind of eat well, fit, we sort of like, okay, now is the time for exercise, now is the time for watching television. And there's a sort of rising movement now about the notion of getting back to more incidental exercise, of which this mix and match fits quite well. So it's not a question of staying fit, it's a question of shifting how much we move around through the day. So that there are studies in Brisbane at the present moment in offices where there's a kind of a rule that if you're on the same floor you have to go and talk to someone rather than send them an email. Or that you're encouraged to actually drop the kids 500 metres from the school every day, much to their complaint, and so on. It's just simply create more incidental movement in the day rather than create special periods.
And I think I'd just like to pick up on that point about dropping the kids and your point about the purpose of the journey, because we in Brisbane have set up this joint CSIRO government eco-science precinct, and the planners for that, I think, very intelligently decided to make it so you could only get there by public transport. And guess what? There's a lot of women work there who have children below work age. And what do? Drop the kids off at work and drive the car to work? They can't do that. And so I think that, there's some gender issues around planning for transport, because women are working now, and we are working when we've got babies and children who can't go to work on a bus. And it's been very interesting trying to work that through with an organisation that doesn't have childcare centre and doesn't have anywhere for their mums to park, and has a huge swathe of young scientists with children, which is a wonderful thing, working for it.
Right, further questions? We'll have to...
When you spoke about diseases, you tend to speak about infectious disease and things like obesity. What about loneliness and social isolation, which I think are probably a bigger issue for Brisbane than the others?
Yeah. People are starting to collate good figures now because a lot of the developed world has really good statistics gathering material, and they're now definitely showing a positive correlation between behavioural disorders, mental disorders, and urban dwelling. There's a whole series of papers come out about the incidence of schizophrenia, for instance, and living in urban environments. So the more people are looking at it, yes, the more positive correlations they're finding. I personally am not a Queenslander. I've moved up here from Adelaide. I've left behind family and friends, and it's quite lonely sometimes trying to crack into a new city and develop a support network. And I can understand how some people can become socially isolated, depressed, and, you know, turn to other sorts of behaviours which other society might perceive to be erratic or anything along those lines. My concern is at my age, I've just been recently diagnosed as a diabetic. So I've had to up my activity level, which I wish the environment was more conducive to, and yet I live in an environment where I'm almost completely dependent on having a car to do simple things like the shopping or to get to work. I live in a sort of isolated suburb which doesn't have those facilities, and trying to do everything on a push bike is what I should be doing, and yet it would create all sorts of problems. So I agree totally with you. The more research that's done in these areas, the more I'm afraid we'll find there are all sorts of diseases, infectious and non-infectious, associated with urban living.
I'm pleased you brought it up, because if you look at the national mental health surveys over the years, that you do see an increase in depression and anxiety in particular. You don't actually see an increase in the psychotic illnesses, which are more genetically based, although you do see an increase in symptomology as a result of alienation. So the real issue in urban environment is why that is the case. And is it that people are simply isolated from each other by the design of the city? Or is it that the way in which life is now, that at certain change points one finds one's, like for example, retiring from work, where one's social network is all around work and one is isolated from that? Or is it that because we tend to move around, almost half of Australians shift every 5 years now, that the notion of connected community is very much lost, and therefore a new set of kind of skills or ways of operating in modern suburbs is needed? Or is it simply that people have never developed the skills? And there's a whole range of ways of beginning to think about and address that kind of issue. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of evidence that shows that social isolation leads to distress, particularly anxiety and depression.
But I'm just wondering about how that affects suicide rates, because in Australia our highest suicide at risk group is rural young men. So perhaps it's just that social isolation isn't necessarily a function
actually
of
the
cities.
highest risk group is in fact old people.
Is it?
Yeah. Those people over 70, not often talked about, but in fact the suicide rate amongst people over 70 is the highest group, and always has been, actually. So it's an important issue. There may be many reasons why people in old age take their own life.
Question or comment?
I think people move to the city because they have to find a job and they have to live in the very good infrastructure like healthcare system and also education. The problem of people move to the city if I think they earn more money and then they try to spend their money, like they eat a lot, and also, you know, they drink a lot, smoke a lot, and they get fat, they get chronic disease, they don't exercise. So we're talking about like chronic disease, like cardiovascular disease, like stroke, and diabetes, and also disease that related to obesity, and some problem of psychiatry, but I think it's more likely like people have hypertension and cardiovascular disease. But how we going to solve the problem? That's the question.
I think it's really quite interesting, this idea of chronic disease, because there's a lot of chronic disease in rural areas. And one of the key aspects, that potential risk factors in both rural and in urban areas, is that we sit still an awful lot of the time now. We don't move around, and our food intake is greater than our exercise. That's actually also the case in rural areas. There's very little sort of moving around kind of work any longer. So the question is, you know, what is it about the urban environment that might be acting as a risk factor to that? Because it's pretty high in rural areas too. And the nature of work is one of the ways of looking at that. The nature of work no longer has us do very much. One of the things I do in community groups is I get people to write a long list of all the things they did 10, 15 years ago that they don't do now, like winding down the window. Turning the knob on the radio rather than pressing something. You can make a fantastic list of the things that we actually no longer do for comfort, which actually is damaging our health. Now, that's in the case in rural areas as well as in urban areas. But there, you know, in urban areas there may be some special things around the nature of comfort that perhaps we could shift.
It's something we have to aggressively pursue. How do you change human behaviour? If we're identifying our sedentary lifestyle as being chronic disease predisposing, we need to do something about it. So it's public education, it's motivation, it's some people so busy with their lifestyle, earning money and, you know, going off and having either no social life or a set social life. Where do they make the time? Where do they put in the 24 hours of a day, 1 hour to do some regular exercise? So we're going to have to, as a society, really put some carrots and sticks out there to get people to change their behaviour. It's one of the hardest things that faces us.
Part of that is the design of cities and buildings. That's
Could-
lift out of buildings. People have to
Sorry, could you say all again?
I work on the 33rd floor. No.
Could you?
The comment I made was that part of the solution is in the way in which we design our towns and cities and the buildings within those cities that encourage people to be more active. So active transport is one way, and having dedicated infrastructure and those types of things, and the design of buildings and facilities and the way we interact so that we are more active. So that was, yeah, extreme if you do live on the 33rd floor and you have to walk up the flight of stairs. But for other areas in buildings, we could introduce more active ways of interacting with our urban environment.
I think you're right with that. I mean, one of the things which is coming through sort of workplace design at the moment is the concept of not having a desk. There's a number of large sort of institutions which are now following this kind of route, and the main one I'm trying to think of is escaping me at the moment, but it is one of the big four banks, I think. Their new HQ in Sydney, even the CEO doesn't actually have an office. There are no offices, they're all open spaces. And that I think works on a number of levels. It works on the social aspect, and that it almost forces you then to find new people to talk to and seek out your colleagues. So there's very much an open forum in that respect, but equally it does actually promote walking around more and more action and more activity during the day. So I think you're right, there are a lot of things that we can do within design, especially within buildings, and the new buildings coming out now. I mean, I've been lucky enough to see some of the new fit-outs done by some quite large organisations, and they do have some quite fantastic fit-outs on the inside of their buildings to promote not only active movement around, but also to promote the social and the psychological aspects of working together. as an academic, it's very easy to be in your office, glued to your computer, your spreadsheet or whatever, and not having your head up for a day or two or a week. And that's clearly not good on an ongoing process. So I think you're right with what you're saying there.
Okay. I don't want to end the discussion. I want to actually just transplant it. I would implore people to come up and ask questions and to share and to network and to actually talk about the topic, because I think there's so much hidden behind the question, are our cities making us sick? There's so much we need to put there. So to wind up the official proceedings here, could I ask that Professor Jamie Schulmeister from the School of Geography, Planning and Environmental Management wind it up? And this is their school prospectus. I'll just make this one little quote out of the book, which I've actually found to be really appealing. They're talking about understanding, modelling, constructing and managing natural, cultural and built environments. So it's not just a matter of, you know, taking lifts out of buildings, it's changing the way people think, and it's actually making sure that we are still part of nature. So it is an integrated, holistic thing that they're actually trying to do in the future planning of cities or the remediation of ones that have got it wrong. James.
Thank you, Peter. I'd first of all like to thank the four panellists, Peter, Rosemary, Robert and Dominic. I think cumulatively they have given us an absolutely fantastic presentation on various aspects of health and urban systems. And I would be very grateful if you could show your appreciation for their efforts. I'm going to take this opportunity to make a couple of remarks on the actual topic. I was one of the dissenting 20%. I would make the point that we live longer today than we have ever in human history, and part of that's due to urbanisation, but part of it's due to the change in urbanisation. One of my fields is paleoecology, and I reconstruct past environments by looking at plants and animals. One of the animal groups that I look at are beetles. And one of the things that we find in our records is that in urban areas, the beetle faunas have completely changed in the developed world. In the old days, the beetle faunas that we found in the records are almost entirely now found in sewers and cesspits. And what we now find in cities are beetles associated with carpets and wood and the odd cockroach. But I think this is an absolutely essential topic. We've got, as was pointed out by Dominic, world population's heading towards 9 billion, and the vast population is going to be in urban areas, and the health of urban populations is critical. I think what I'd like to finish with is just to say most of my points were stolen by Peter, that there is a reception outside, that this is part of the Global Leadership Series, and for the alumni there are more events coming up later in the year. The next major one I'd highlight to you is that there's the 2012 Alumni Reunion Day on Saturday the 12th of May, and that if you check in your purple bags, there's both flyers for that event, and there's a variety of information about the two schools involved, including the brochure for my school, GPEM. So I'll finish up by saying, on behalf of the School of Geography, Planning and Environmental Management, and also on behalf of the School of Chemistry and Molecular Biosciences, and thank you also to the Faculty of Science and to Stephen, if you could join us outside at the reception and take the opportunity to mingle with our panellists and continue the discussion on this very important topic. Thank you.